some species that are reputed to make a so-called toxin called domoic acid, but I won't talk about that now. I come back. But only a few species produce this toxin. And even then, they don't make it all the time, the same species. Sometimes they make more, sometimes less, nobody knows why. But I'm just saying, the point is that these reports of these toxic algae, for instance, you sent me a report from the North Pacific in the Bering Strait, Alexandrium catenatum. Now, that species also grows in the Atlantic, on the other side, along on the Atlantic coast of the USA. And it's also universal. It's been recorded all over the planet. All right. So toxic algae. What are these toxins? What does an alga, toxic alga, get out of poisoning a human being walking on the land, right? What is the effect? And there is no effect. These toxins that we are talking about, these are molecules that are peculiar. They have a peculiar structure, right? Like this that I was telling you about, this Alexandrium catenatum now in the Bering Strait. It makes little molecules that are called saxitoxin. And it's just got a name from that for a certain reason. Now, what the saxitoxin does is a small molecule. It can accidentally block sodium channels in the neurons. So your neurons, they need to have a flow of potassium and sodium going in and out. And then they have special pores called sodium pores, sodium channels. And this little saxitoxin gets stuck in those things and blocks them. It's accidental. It's not a toxin like that, right? It's an accidental molecule. And what happens is the people who eat this, ingest saxitoxin from eating mussels that concentrate the stuff, they then get paralyzed. And then they die of that because you can't breathe and so on, right? But that can be gotten rid of. Now, these species that make those kind of toxins, they only grow in coastal areas, right? The coastal areas that have periodically such kind of toxic blooms. And then in the past, let's say 30 years ago, there used to be incidences of toxic algae causing deaths and problems. I also had that in Naples in a 5-star hotel. I ate mussels for dinner, and in the night, 3 hours later, I had to run to the toilet, and it was terrible. And again, I don't know what this algae gets out of poisoning us, but anyway, that's another story. I have some experience with this. And now, yeah, here they are. These are small little molecules. Domoic acid is also small. And these toxins in the algae, they are not deadly. Hardly anybody has died of algal toxins in the last 15 years or so, 20 years, because it's all being monitored. So the mussels, they check that they don't have any of these toxins that can kill you or disable you, like the one that gave me diarrhea, right? The diuretic shellfish poison is called. And that is everywhere all the time. But if you just think this garden around me, right? I have many different plants, but how many of them can I eat? If I were to eat every one of these plants, I would definitely die. These are normal garden plants because they all have some form of herbivore deterrent. And if we had a lot of slugs this year, and they ate up a lot of plants that have become extinct, they're not there anymore because they ate them all up. There was a mass influx of slugs all over Germany, but also in Britain that I know of. So you have these periodic things. And then those plants that were not eaten by the slugs, quite a few actually, they take over the garden, right? And this is also happening in the plankton. You have the same predator-prey or herbivore food arms race. It's called an arms race, right? And because one is making a defense and the other is making an attack to overcome that defense. And this is going on all the time. And these so-called toxins, some of these toxins are part of that arsenal that is developed. So this threat of toxic algae growing in connection with iron fertilization is also, I'm sorry to say, bullshit. Because it's been shown also. What happened in the 1980s was the awareness of eutrophication. It became a big issue, eutrophication. And at the same time, there were also these toxic algae incidences, more common, right? There was this killer algal bloom in the North Sea. And in Baltic and North Sea, like the entrance there. And that killed a lot of organisms. But that was, again, a freak event. Because the alga that was responsible, Chrysochromulina polylepis, it's called, is there all the time. It's there now also, right? But in that year, it made a very high concentration in the pycnocline, on the way out. And that was a fluke here, and that high concentration in the pycnocline killed a lot of salmon, farmed salmon, because they couldn't swim away. It also killed other animals. It has a contact, not a toxin, it's an enzyme that breaks down the mucous tissue. That's what happened. So it had these effects. But that led to a scare story. And then there were other scare stories also, like that same year that you had the killer algal bloom, in that summer of that year, a lot of seals died on the North Sea coast. And people believed that it was the same cause. And I gave an interview. I was asked to give an interview on this topic about the seals dying. And the seals were dying of a disease that dogs also have. I forget the name now. Staupe is the German name. Okay, it's a disease that dogs get, and the seals got that because seals are dogs, right? They're aquatic dogs, and they were dying of that. They had nothing to do with the killer algae. But when I went to the studio to give the interview, and I just before the interview started, I said these two things are not related. The people who were going to interview me said, "Don't say that, please don't say that, because nobody will believe you. They will think it's the government just wants to calm you down." That means it's better to have a scare story out there and froth them out with the scare story rather than clean it up. Now, with domoic acid is soluble compound. It's an amino acid. It's one of the amino acids that's not of any, it's not used anywhere. I mean, that's why the function of domoic acid is completely unknown. Nobody knows what the thing is. Huh? And it has occurred in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. All right. The species that are making domoic acid are everywhere. The Pseudo-nitzschia, I mentioned that already. Rather, the domoic acid is made mostly in temperate waters, right? And there's one incident in the Gulf of St. Lawrence where about 100 people were affected by it and 3 died. And these people who died were in old people's home. And domoic acid is water soluble, and then kidneys excrete it, get rid of it. And here, these people who died of it, they probably had some kidney problems. So it accumulated and killed them. And domoic acid is really a toxin because it mimics one of these hormones, and it breaks down brain cells. So it had an effect. And what it does is also that it's very characteristic. Animals that have eaten domoic acid, also humans, they get disoriented, right? So it's called amnesic shellfish poisoning because it affects the memory. Because it hits the hippocampus. This is the part of the brain which is responsible for all of this. Now, the Pseudo-nitzschia and this domoic acid has been around all the time. It's been all over the place. And the effects of domoic acid are very characteristic. So an animal that has taken domoic acid becomes disoriented and lies around the place and does these things. It does strange kind of things, right? And that has never been reported before. It was only the first time that was reported in this place. So this poisoning of humans happened for the first time in 1987, I think, or 88 or 87, I forget, at that time. And it didn't happen before. And it never happened after that. So it has never happened anywhere else since then because the effects of the toxin are very characteristic. Now, the Gulf of St. Lawrence also has lots of seals, right? These seals that live there also. But there was no report of any other animal being hit by this domoic acid incident that killed these people. Right? The only place where seals are affected is off California, the sea lions of California. Right? This is the pictures you were showing. And this is only happening. You have seals all over the northern and southern hemisphere, in the temperate and Arctic regions, right? And polar regions. But these are the only incidents that we know of marine animals, mammals in this case, being affected by domoic acid. And the effect on the intermediate grazers are krill and copepods. And lots of experiments have been done with them, and there's no effect being shown. They don't care. They eat it. Doesn't matter. They don't have a hippocampus in their brain, all right? But so it's interesting why in California, these sea lions were affected and nowhere else. Right? And then, on top of all of this, the sea lion population in California is thriving, is growing up like that. It has not been affected in any way by the domoic acid incidents. the tens or 20s of seals lying on the beaches. Of course, as California is, the beaches are heavily populated. So every time a seal lands up and gets disoriented and hangs around, people report it. And then there's somebody who comes and picks it up. There are incidences. I think this year there was also an incidence of where sea lions were affected. But again, it was in the tens, right? And of course, now that we have all these highly precise measurements for measuring all sorts of organic compounds, you find domoic acid in the guts of all kinds of animals that die, that land up on the beach, right? But that doesn't mean they died of domoic acid. They just had domoic acid in their gut. There's no connection being made yet that I know of that has shown the effect of domoic acid on marine mammals outside of California. So the question actually is, so why are the California sea lions? And then it's also young females. The males are not affected, not that I know of. It's not been reported. But then again, because we had this latent fear that saved us from predators in the past, we are looking around and this fear gets activated very easily. And we're living in a time where people are trying to manipulate people, influence them and make them change their views, or whatever, to buy more of this or vote for that candidate or this candidate. So this fear factor is used as a lever to mobilize people who have their own agenda in mind. Now, of course, you could say, I'm trying to break this thing down and saying it's not bad and so on, but I don't have an agenda. I'm not going to get rich with this iron fertilization. And I think what worries me is the whales. I don't want the whales to become extinct. That's why I am making this plea that we have to go out and bring the whales back. And for that, we need to fertilize. We need to do what the whales were doing to get the whales back.
Summarize the entire question, or the answer to the question is it depends which area of the ocean we choose. So we should not choose to try to fertilize the area of San Francisco and maybe even any kind of coastal area.
No, but they have Pseudo-nitzschia blooms almost every year. And some years they have more, and sometimes less. And the seal episodes are reported, of course, in the press. They're not that common. And in the Southern Ocean, there are only 2 measurements that have been done up to now that found domoic acid. 2 out of I don't know how many. We measured domoic acid in our experiments also. There was none, 0. And we gave that to laboratories in Jena, the Max Planck Institute, and they couldn't find any domoic acid. The point is that not wanting to save the whales because of the fear of domoic acid is, to my mind, ridiculous. It's just absurdly ridiculous.
So to summarize the rate of domoic acid per Pseudo-nitzschia measurement, do you think it's 1 to 1,000, 1 to 10,000, 1 to 1 million? If we were to sample Pseudo-nitzschia all around the ocean, how much domoic acid would we find? And in fact, I tried asking this question to ChatGPT and it actually gave me quite a high rate. So sometimes AI doesn't work. So I'd love to also point out when we have an expert who can beat AI. So if we were to ask rate of domoic acid per Pseudo-nitzschia sample, we get high numbers by just like this high level AI thinking. So where would you put it in your your experience, your stomach feeling?
Toxic algae is an industry working on toxic algae because it has to do with seafood, and there are many scientists who then moved to toxic algae because it was easy to get funds. So naturally, then you don't go around saying, oh, the money I got to show that this algae has got toxins or not. They're not going to say that. They're going to say, oh, we averted this catastrophe from happening, or we used the money and saved people's lives and so on. So they were on the search for new toxic algae. Instead of relativizing the whole issue, they exacerbated the problem. Okay, what do they show here, for instance? What's well known is that off Portugal, as an example, you have massive blooms of Pseudo-nitzschia, and they're full of domoic acid. But there's no incident that I know of where anything has been affected. And the people who report this, they don't go around saying, oh, Pseudo-nitzschia domoic acid is harmless. Because if something happens, then they'll say, oh, you didn't warn, and so on. So there are very few people who are saying, no, don't worry, it's not going to hit you.
It doesn't make money to say, don't worry.
Yeah, exactly. Conclusion.
And yeah, at least ChatGPT says in the Southern Ocean, you'll find much, much less domoic acid
There's
relative
only
to other
two
regions.
measurements have found domoic acid up to now. Two measurements from a whole lot of, I don't know how many, because again, this is another thing about science, is that negative results are not published. So I don't go and say, I went to the Southern Ocean and I looked for toxic algae and didn't find any. What kind of paper is that, huh? So that person who doesn't find any, he keeps quiet and doesn't tell anybody about it. And the ones that find one measurement, they will make tables showing, oh my God, this was so much and so much. So these things get blown out of proportion because we are receptive to fear stories. No,
So if the currency of science is citations, do you get more citations if you find domoic acid, if you
of
have the
course,
headline?
of course.
So as
Yeah.
a scientist, you get rich in citations reporting negatives.
Yeah. Negative effect. Negative in the sense that if you don't find any, nobody cites you.
And you don't get citated and you don't get further funding by your institutes, and all the incentives of scientists are tilted towards negativity.
Yeah. Negative effects. Yeah. Not negative results. Negative result would mean zero, that you didn't find any. Scientists, when toxicology came out in a big way, we formed a group called GeoHab, which was studying harmful algal blooms. Well, so I was one of the founding members of that group. So I know my way with toxicology, right? And it's just gone out of hand now. It's been exaggerated beyond all necessity. And as I said, there are only two measurements made up to now where they found domoic acid, and they don't talk about the measurements where they didn't find any. Right? So then now it's in the impression is that, oh, there is domoic acid in the Southern Ocean. But based on two measurements out of a series of others, and there also there was none. And the measurements that we have done from Polarstern, they have not found any. There's zero. We are writing a paper on that, by the way. All right, so we continue. And this is the phytoplankton from EisenEx, the 3-week experiment. And here you see this Pseudo-nitzschia. Now, Pseudo-nitzschia has a bad name because we'll talk about that later on. Because in some species, in some places, produce what is known as domoic acid. It's an amino acid. It's an unusual amino acid. And it has been implicated in poisoning people. At one incident in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, on Prince Edward Island, 3 people died as a result of that. Right? It was a very mysterious issue. What happened? And these people had eaten shellfish. And shellfish, meaning mussels, they concentrate phytoplankton. And this effect was noticed in this old people's home. And there was another about 100 people were also affected. They had symptoms, but then that passed away. Now, that was then identified with domoic acid produced by a Pseudo-nitzschia bloom. Now, the Pseudo-nitzschia bloom was very extensive. It was all across the Gulf of St. Lawrence. This is the opening of the St. Lawrence River that flows out from in eastern Canada. And it was only in one locality, and nothing like that had happened before. It has a very peculiar symptoms. It's called amnesic shellfish poisoning because this domoic acid enters the brain, is able to, in this particular incident, and do damage to the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a part of the brain that is responsible for spatial memory. So that's the hippocampus was affected, but it never had happened before because the symptoms are very particular, very peculiar and specific for this domoic acid poisoning, and it hadn't happened anywhere else. And since then also there are no reports. This happened in 1988, 88 or 89 or something, as far as I can remember. Now, this domoic acid is produced by Pseudo-nitzschia in many different places. It's mostly temperate, the phytoplankton in temperate zones. And it's also found off California, where it has affected the sea lions. There are a few incidents where sea lions were affected by domoic acid, but otherwise nowhere else. There are no reports of any effects of domoic acid in the Southern Ocean. So animals that are affected by domoic acid exhibit disorientation, right? Because of the hippocampus effect. So they don't know where they are and roam around a little bit, the seals in California. But it has never been found anywhere else. The problem with it is that it's the major reason why iron fertilization experiments were discontinued. Because it was reported that it could lead to domoic acid poisoning. Now this Pseudo-nitzschia bloom in 2000, of course, we took samples and sent it to the lab. There's a lab in Max Planck Institute for Chemical Ecology in Jena, and they measured domoic acid and they found none, zero, no traces. But the problem, of course, in science is that negative results are not reported. So you don't have 100 papers saying we searched for domoic acid, didn't find, or we looked for symptoms of domoic acid poisoning, didn't find. So this one incident where these people, this was also an old people's home, by the way. The 3 people who died were from an old people's home. So they were affected. And that is now the story. The domoic acid is deadly, and there are lots of papers out there on domoic acid and studying domoic acid in phytoplankton and so on and so forth. But the effects have only been seen in these 2 places. This one incident in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, never ever reported after that. There are also seals there and birds and so on, never reported, no effect. And off California also, occasionally. That's last year. Now this year, dolphins and seals were reported that were lying on the beach and had domoic acid. So this domoic acid is something which the body doesn't take up. Lots of experiments have been done with rats. And if you feed rats domoic acid, it goes out with the feces. 90 so much % of the domoic acid is not excreted because it doesn't go into the body. It's defecated. So if they're doing studies with domoic acid, they have to inject it. Right? Of course, no human experiments have been done, but I personally don't think that domoic acid is of consequence. It's one of the standard molecules that you get out there, secondary metabolites, because we don't know its function. But it has had major consequences in that iron fertilization experiments were stopped. This specter of whales dying of domoic acid toxicity was spread then by people measuring domoic acid, but they don't know anything about it. So toxic dinoflagellates I already mentioned to you. No, this is the only toxic diatom, the Pseudo-nitzschia, and from this incidence. Whereas toxic dinoflagellates, that's a real threat. But these toxic dinoflagellates don't occur in the Southern Ocean. They're not there. And they have been looked for, and if they were found, it would be also propagated. But again, negative results are not presented. But it has had a big influence on the perception of iron fertilization experiments, that it might lead to this. So we had 25% of the biomass of this EisenEx bloom was Pseudo-nitzschia. And Pseudo-nitzschia it's one of the most common genera in the Southern Ocean. They're different species, and these species are not domoic acid producers. And we don't know the function of domoic acid, by the way. A lot of work is done. A lot of people have been working on this, but we have not made any headway. So I'm going to write a paper now saying that we should now shelve this, because there's nothing going on, really. Of course, there's a problem always. If you want to study something which could be dangerous or lead to some kind of noxious effect, then you get funding for it, right? And then, of course, that funding will then stop. Yeah, so that's why it's tricky to get this stuff published. What kind of troubles you have publishing data like that people don't like, because we proved that this iron fertilization does lead to carbon export. Because at that time it was, people were saying, the people who did the other experiments, they were saying, oh, we didn't find any particle export, so it's not important, because they were against geoengineering. They didn't want, first of all, more experiments, and then also to start doing this in a big way to remove carbon dioxide. It's unpopular, also in the scientific circles, very unpopular, as a matter of fact. And I stress here again, I'm an exception because I push it, so don't think that this is mainstream thinking. No? On the other hand, it's up to you to decide whether it makes sense or not. So when this paper was published in Nature in 2012, there was huge press attention to this paper, and they were all positive. Wow, it works. Iron fertilization works. But then, There was another experiment carried out by a person who wants to make money on it, right? And then everybody was against iron fertilization again because they don't want to have that happen. And I don't want to have that happen either, but that doesn't mean that we should throw the baby out with the bathwater, as the expression goes, right? The scientific community should continue carrying out experiments. And then, so even if there is an outbreak of domoic acid, that doesn't equate with the whales dying. This is more a gut feeling looking for excuses not to do something like that because they're a bit worried that, oh my God, we are playing God or what? That's a human frailty, it's a weakness in humans who will allow massive damage, like bottom trawling is allowed. They're doing bottom trawling all over the place. And what are they destroying? It's incredible. But they'll stop you from doing iron fertilization in the Southern Ocean. It's ridiculous. We have to be much more realistic. And if that's where we have to look and see what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. And what doesn't make sense, we should just not follow. And that's the job of science, is to educate us in this direction. And there's an urgent need to restore the ecosystems that we have degraded, the oceans, particularly the people, there's a movement almost going on, hands off the ocean, leave the ocean alone. The ocean is not going to recover unless we do something about it. Because this is such a simple thing to do, play whale, by adding iron, that, we should just do it. And I'm hoping that your generation now will be more enlightened and push for this. I've been giving this lecture now for a couple of years, and the students are much more open now to understanding what needs to be done than in the past when there was this scare, hands off and don't. No? Humans have only done damage. Yes, we've only done damage because we've done the wrong things. So now we need to do the right thing.